Good morning. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. I'm director of the Institute for Government, a think tank of about 50 people here in London looking at good government. And I'm delighted to be hosting this session this morning on this provocative, and I think it really is a provocative theme of good governance, best practices in a variegated world. And the proposition of this session is that good governance underpins economic prosperity, stable growth, and political stability. But what does that look like in a world of so many different economic and political models? Well, we've got a tremendous panel here to discuss exactly that. My left is Robert Barrington, who is Chief Executive of Transparency International UK. And here we have Elena Lazarou, who has two hats, both very, very relevant to this. She's an assistant professor in the Center for International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, the largest public policy think tank in Brazil, and is also a policy analyst for the European Parliament, and is Greek. That's many, many different ways in which she can come at these questions. And then we have Nairi Woods, who is Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, and I hope we're going to be joined also by Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Well, we're going to kick off with this, but I had in mind when accepting chairing this session, an encounter, a kind of black comedy in a way, when Joe Stiglitz was appointed the chief economist of the World Bank way back in the 90s, and in a buoyant figure then and now. He gave his first press conference and somewhat disconcerted the chief of communications of the World Bank, who would be otherwise known to some of you as Lord Malloch Brown. And Joe Stiglitz said, why don't we look at what's gone so wrong for the World Bank in Africa? This was not quite the opening message they wanted their star hire to give. But the thesis that he set out, in which his colleagues at the World Bank then did plunge into talking about, was whether the bank had underestimated the importance of good governance in getting anything going in a country and in making the best of money put in or of other help. Anyway, that is simply one. Welcome, Emily Thornberry. That is simply one strand of the kind of things we're going to talk about this morning. And with that, let me kick off with Nairi Woods, who's offered to give us her first thoughts on this idea. Good governance, are there things that we can say cross countries? Do you agree with the proposition that good governance, in a sense, underpins political stability and growth?
I think, I hope that's working. I think in the 1990s, that was the point. So Truman back in the 40s said, for international cooperation, we just need to let more and more countries become democracies, and then countries will cooperate. And 1990 was the victory of that idea. And as a result, right through the 1990s, I think there was a huge belief that if we just encourage countries to have good governance, then they will grow, and this will be a virtuous circle. And those ideas, I regret to say, are totally smashed today. If you look at the world's trust indicators, it is the world's democracies that are suffering the least trust. It's the world's fastest growing economies that are recording the highest levels of trust in government. Maybe it's growth that leads to more trust, which permits more government, and not vice versa. So for me, the challenge is this. I think we live in quite a complacent world in Western democracies, where we think if we just keep preaching our values, somehow everything will be all right. And that's challenged on two fronts. One, it's not working even in our own countries. It certainly isn't working across the European Union. Look at what's going on in Rome, in Vienna, in Warsaw, in Budapest, in the United States. And then it's not working at the international system level. We've seen a huge drawing back by the United States from this liberal international order that it created. And so we really need to rethink. And I guess my provocation this morning would be that when it comes to international cooperation, we now need to focus, we need to stop talking about values. It's not that values aren't important, don't get me wrong. It's that they do not substitute for a close look at where countries' long-term strategic interests lie and how to forge accommodation with other countries in order to ensure that you don't have conflict, that you have cooperation instead of conflict. And that's one piece of it, is a new strategic kind of cooperation with Russia, with China, with countries that we must stop trying to preach to and start making arrangements for mutual accommodation. Because otherwise, the trade conflict, the conflicts by proxy, will create an atmosphere of fear, anxiety, and nationalism, which will make it impossible even to fight for our values at home. So I think that's one part of it.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to take that as a rebuttal of the proposition, saying, no, it's not working, and actually if we pursue this, trying to export our values, we're possibly going to create conflict with countries of different values, such as Russia and China, that we actually need to cooperate with. And I would take that as a no, as I said, the first one. Robert, that's a direct challenge in a way to what your organisation does.
Yes, and therefore, naturally, I disagree with Nari in many ways. I mean, Nari has a slightly depressing view of the world, I think, in that regard. or if you extrapolate from it, I think what you might get there is a world in which you get a small number of strong states that are fantastic at exploiting the weaker states to the detriment of those weaker state citizens, and the strong states thrive, and that's all fine. Well, you know, I don't think that's good enough in terms of what we want as a world order, to use that very old-fashioned term. When I look across Transparency International, we've got chapters in 100 countries, they're all locally staffed, locally governed, and so on. What is really interesting there is a great commonality of values across those chapters. And just to focus on one issue, which is bribery, I mean, pretty much every country, in fact, I can say certainly every country in the world thinks bribery is a bad thing, according to its laws and constitution. But that, of course, isn't the reality in many countries. And I think one of the issues here is actually the departure of governments from what their laws and constitutions themselves are saying, and that mismatch in terms of what governments exist for in many countries. So there's a fellow at the Brookings Institution who recently said she felt that between 60 and 70 governments around the world have been captured by kleptocrats. So these are no longer people running government in the interests of the people, they're people running government in their own personal enrichment interests. And in that regard, one can see that if there are governance norms, it's actually not that they don't exist across the world, but a relatively large number of governments have started departing from them to the detriment of their citizens.
All right, thanks for that. But you're arguing that, I mean, that it is possible to identify at least some things that the world has, or thinks it has in common in saying this is good government, and then countries depart from that in practice. But it should be possible, in your view, to say what those things are. Elena, let me come to you next. And from either the European or the Brazilian or indeed the global perspective, what do you make of this? Are there some things that we can say, looking across countries, this is the standard, this is good government that they should aspire to?
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I think I'm going to try to bridge the optimist with the pessimist here. I'm not sure we can really say what is good government or good governance looking across the board. What I think we have seen in recent years, and we can definitely say, is that governance survives crisis much less easily than individuals and leaders. And I say this because I think this variegated world that we are seeing, whether it be in Latin America, in Europe, or across the board, is a product of the fact that, as Nairi said, in the 90s and early 2000s, we were really building on this idea that institutions, i.e. governance, can provide good governance and a long-lasting system of international relations and domestic affairs. And then we saw a series of crises. We saw financial crises, we saw security crises, and all this suddenly made us realize that institutions are not as resilient as we thought, but also that voters at moments of crisis tend to trust individuals much more than institutions. And I think this is, at the root cause of why right now we're seeing governance in terms of institutions eroding to an extent, or rather suffering a crisis, whereas we see populism, something that came out yesterday very much. In times of crisis, people are looking to people, they're not looking to institutions. And since governance is based on the idea of institutions working properly, and on the basis of values, of the rule of law, human rights, providing welfare on the domestic and the international level, I think what we've seen is that governance right now is suffering the effects of all these crises that we've seen. So just to finish with the examples you asked me to mention, the European Union is a great example of a project that was meant to be...
exactly this. So the European Union trying to assert its values on its members.
Yeah, the European Union was a governance project. It was about trying to get past leaders and national governments and create a supranational state of governance which will be beneficial for all. But we've seen that these crises have led to a complete erosion of the trust of citizens in these institutions and returning back to trust in national capitals and in very specific types of leaders, as Nairi alluded to. And at the same time in Brazil, since you mentioned Latin America, again there was a sense throughout the 2000s, the times of the BRICS, that economic prosperity will lead to a consolidation of more democratic and trustworthy institutions. And at the moment of the end of the economic boom, suddenly we see again a reversal of this, and of course there was the implosion of corruption. So I think what we've seen is the limitations to good governance that the global and national order have been posing, and that crises in the international system have brought up across the board.
Okay, so we've got another narrative of the difficulty of pushing this forward. Emily, welcome. Let me ask you whether you think there are things that we can identify as good governance that countries should aspire to, and that people will be better off if they achieve them.
I think this is a really interesting and timely discussion. And I do think that I probably have a fairly British perspective on this. And I think that we need to begin with, by far from being complacent, but acknowledging some of the positives that we have within our own country. In terms of, when we were talking about institutions, that many of our institutions have been embedded in our society for a very long time. I'm mindful of meeting Albie Sachs in South Africa just a couple of weeks ago. He's a great lawyer, a constitutional judge. And he was talking about the constitution in South Africa being one that had to be interpreted by proactive judges who were prepared to push the values of the constitution that had created South Africa and had held Parliament and the President to account, and had been a very important part of turning round South Africa in November and walking it back from the brink. Now, we don't have proactive judges, we don't have political judges, and for good reason. But also what he was saying was that when he was talking about how do we draft a constitution for South Africa, he'd said, well, I actually like the Norwegian society, let's go and see Norway and let's find out what their constitution says. And he went along and asked the Norwegians, and they said, yeah, we got a constitution somewhere, just not quite sure where it is. But it was just shows a completely different history and a different culture. And so different countries do come from different perspectives. And I think, a variegated world is absolutely right. And we are at a time, I think, when, some people have argued, and I think that their arguments are interesting and have some validity, that we are at a time of change, that the influence, for example, of a country like China, we know will continue to increase, and we know that there are some values, of course, that they hold in common with us, but there are many that they don't. And the challenge, therefore, is what is going to happen in 20 years? What kind of world will our children be seeing, and what will the dominant values be? My view is that I acknowledge that, but I think that actually there's a lot that in the values that we have that are important, and I think that we should be fighting for much more than we are at the moment. I think that as a country we should be a bit less arrogant about ourselves, but we should be more confident about our history and about the different elements that are in our society. We should be clear about where there are holes, where, for example, our democratic system does not necessarily reflect the views of of a large proportion of the population. We saw that, I think, quite clearly with the Brexit vote, when large numbers of people came out to vote for the first time in decades. That's a challenge to all of us, to us politicians, but to us as a nation as well. How can it be that as a country we have such large numbers of people who are so marginalized? And that, I think, we have to be fixing domestically, but internationally we are in a very interesting position at this pivotal time. We have a place on the Security Council. We have actually a large amount of influence if we want to use it, and we don't want to spend it all just getting sucked into Brexit. And I think that at a time when there is so little international leadership, I don't think that we can do it on our own because we're a small country, but I think that multilaterally we could be in a much stronger leadership position than we actually are. And I'm disappointed to see the way in which so often when there are opportunities, we simply just walk away.
Emily, I want to be clear on one point. Are you arguing for the UK to argue for the merits of democracy more internationally, or for other things that you might wrap into the concept of good governance?
Oh no, of course, it's about ensuring that those who are making decisions are reflecting the views of those who they seek to represent. That otherwise, where is the legitimacy? And I think that, you know, you see at the moment, you know, Trump seems to be incredibly comfortable when talking to people who don't necessarily have the irritation of democracy that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and seems to find it easier to deal with them than it does with, for example, you know, European leaders and our messy democratic systems and our compromises and the difficulties that we wrestle with on a day-to-day basis. He seems to find it much easier there, but that doesn't mean that we lie down and say, oh well, all right, it all looks too difficult. It's just too hard. We have to be there for the fight, I think.
Okay, thanks. I was wondering how long it was going to be before the word Trump came into this. All right, so we've got a pitch for democratic values explicitly as part of good governance. I want to put one thing to the panel. I'm going to come very early to questions. One thing, and just to tease out this sense which has run through our conversation so far, is there a cluster of things that we might identify as good governance? Not being corrupt, providing security for the country, providing the conditions for prosperity, perhaps for innovation, safeguarding the weakest, the rule of law. Is there a cluster of things there where we can say that countries should aspire to this, or are those very embedded in a very Western democratic sense? And then what do you make of Emily's explicit pitch for, look, democratic values we should be arguing for? Nairi, let me come back to you.
Yeah, so I think the challenge is this. Government should be accountable for delivering to its citizens, for not just being in it for itself, for not being corrupt, etc. And the challenge is different in different parts of the world. And I see two challenges. For democracies, the challenge is that democracies have become so short-term, and the more populist they become, the more short-term they become, that they can neither formulate long-term strategic interests at home, let alone abroad, let alone pursue them. And the challenge for the autocracies of the world is that when you're a ruler for life, or when you're a ruler for a very long time, you very quickly lose access to challenge and information. You very quickly become the deluded King Lear, who the courtiers are assuring is absolutely marvelous and wonderful in every possible way. And that is the recipe for, again, very bad decision-making. So both systems are very challenged. And I think democracies now have to really think about what are the institutions that we need to build, what are the processes we need to build in order to have a long-term capacity. And it's about much more than fighting corruption. And just to reply on the corruption, I don't think, frankly, that 20 years of preaching anti-corruption and building anti-corruption units has done very much.
You've made the point that it hasn't worked, but what I'm pushing at is whether you think it's not, that actually the effort is wrong in itself.
Well, I think we've got to trust the fact that if you look at every poll, there's nobody in the world that actually wants to live in a corrupt society. So let countries build integrity in government. Let them build governments that work. We know that in many countries, people have preferred a slightly corrupt government that works to a non-corrupt government that's paralyzed and doesn't. We need to take that seriously and help countries find their own systems to build government that works.
So you'd like them to aspire to it. And to be clear, you want governments to be accountable, but not necessarily within a democracy, democratic framework. Yeah. Okay, Robert, let me come back to you. What do you...
Thank you. I mean, first of all, just to clarify, you know, I absolutely don't believe in the sort of imposition of some kind of top-down universal values on every country in the world. That clearly isn't going to work. But what I'm saying is that when you look at people's citizens' responses, you do get a commonality of values, as you were just saying, I think. But I think, one way to look at this, what are the important institutions, is to look at what institutions, if you're a kleptocrat, you most immediately want to subvert. And I've got a list of 4 of those. So the first thing you want to do is capture the judiciary. That's really critical. And you see that happening all over the world. Secondly, you want to make sure that the internal security is on your side. So the police, likewise, you've captured them. But then you want to enrich yourself, so you want to find a couple of institutions where you can get as much money as possible. Well, classically, it's state-owned enterprises or the control of the private sector, as one seen in Russia. And alongside that, you desperately want the Ministry of Defence, partly because it helps with your security, but mainly because it's got massive amounts of money totally spent in secret. So if you can get control over those 4 institutions, you're a long way in terms of being a kleptocrat, which says to me that if you want to have integrity in government, try and make sure those 4 institutions are defended.
Elena, quick word on this, and then I'm going to, there's questions beginning to flood in. Yes.
Well, I very much agree with what Robert said, but I also agree with Nairi that fortunately or unfortunately, we've seen that this strategy of trying to bring in values and elements of governance from abroad, by and large, doesn't work very well. So I think the important thing, and of course the challenging thing, is to try and influence or help these things come out from bottom up, so from society to the governing institutions. Now that is a huge challenge. It's very easy to say, but very difficult to do. But I have to say that it seems that there is no other way to consolidate good practices, good values in governance and in governments than to have a critical mass of citizens in that country who vote and who want that. So I think education, I think promoting civil society, I think bringing these ideas in from bottom up, as I said, is much more of an efficient way, albeit a way that takes much longer to implement than to say, from top down, this is how you have to do things, because we've seen it doesn't work. And education, I just want to finish on education. I think it's really, really important, because in a lot of the countries that we're talking about, many times, unfortunately, citizens are not aware of what checks and balances mean, or what it means to have an independent judiciary, to have free media. And as soon as you start to educate and they realize what this means, the citizens themselves become the defenders of good governance. And we've seen this very much in Brazil with the role that the judiciary played initially against government corruption.
Emily, quick word on judiciary.
I just want to. I think I'm going to just sort of expose my lawyer's petticoat. I mean, I was a lawyer for 25 years before I was elected to Parliament, and during those years, we used to kind of bang on about the rule of law, the rule of law, the rule of law, and I don't think I ever really truly understood it. I mean, I'd learned about it, and I was practicing it, I suppose. But it was only when I met people from countries where there was no rule of law. So I met somebody, perhaps I shouldn't say, but I met someone from a country where they were saying they had just sacked all their judiciary because they were all corrupt. And I was saying, well, who are you going to choose? And how is that going to be chosen? And of course it has to be about independent judiciary, but it also has to be, I know we all know this, but it needs to be stated. The rules apply to everybody equally. Everybody is equal under the law. If you break the law, no matter who you are, you'll get done for it. There's no point in having laws if they only apply to some people, or if they only apply to the people who can't bribe the judge enough. So I think that's an absolute cornerstone of any country at all. And I think what's interesting, frankly, about Brazil was some of the, I think, outrageous decisions that were made, particularly in relation to Dilma and her, toppling, frankly, by the use of the courts. I don't think, I was severely worried about that, and so I'm interested to hear that you're saying that now actually the courts are at the vanguard. But I don't think, I think they can be used very badly as well. The idea that a president can be toppled because she exaggerates the strength of the economy in advance of an election, good Lord. Imagine if we were to apply that in our country.
We're not going to go there. I'm going to go to questions now, because I think there are going to be quite a few, and I've got some here. There's one right here. Sorry, you're inaccessibly right in the middle of your block.
Thank you. With extremely stimulating points, but I would like to give you a paradox, not a question, a paradox that I've been facing after more than 20 years working on promoting better governance and...
Yeah. And forgive me, would you like to say who you are, please?
Yes, Ramon Bleco, I'm the European Union ambassador to Iraq. So in my previous incarnation and Spanish diplomat and working in the Spanish Cooperation Agency in the 90s, we've been very deeply involved in promotion of good governance, especially in Central America as part of the conflict resolution processes and state reform. More than 20 years later, sometimes I'm facing the dilemma that corruption sometimes have replaced these conflicts in a way in which the elites have decided to shift from fighting for resources to actually sharing them. And being in Iraq is an example in which recently we saw in the elections the rejection of the voters for what they perceive as these elites sharing the national resources in detriment of the population. So we are now in a situation in which that fight against corruption may increase the risk of internal conflict. And that is the kind of paradox that I find sometimes difficult to solve, in which our support for anti-corruption policies and anti-corruption strategies sometimes is an element that will fuel those internal conflicts in those countries. Certainly, we do support the anti-corruption policies. We have started different programs on public finance management and other reform-oriented policies of the government. But now the winner of the election is actually promoting a drive against corruption that is already mobilizing some of the, let's say, part of the former elite that feels threatened about it, and will be probably an element of conflict. So,
Thank you very much indeed for that insight and that experience. Robert, what do you say to that worldliness, if you like, that, look, it's all very well to pursue corruption, but sometimes it's not possible, sometimes it actually leads you into conflict with other
Yeah, I mean, one of the infuriating things about working in Transparency International is when the world doesn't match with the theory, which happens, 99% of the time. And I mean, Iraq's a particularly interesting case, I think, when one looks at how corruption damages citizens. And to take the fall of Mosul as an example, why did it fall so quickly to ISIL? Well, there are various reasons, but 50,000 ghost soldiers on the roll of the Iraqi army meant to be defending Mosul that day were not there because they didn't exist, because their salaries were being drawn by generals who weren't military figures, but had actually paid for their positions in the army and needed to recoup the money and enrich themselves. So, corruption, I think we can all agree, is deeply damaging to the citizens of the country. So there, immediately one has a common value, just as one has with the rule of law. I think your question is, have our strategies been correct for dealing with them? Almost certainly not, because as you mentioned, they can have unintended consequences. They can often fail and have failed around the world. So I think, where I arrive at is there's a commonality of values in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Our strategies have not been very good. And just picking up on what the point other panelists have made, we clearly need much more subtle, regional, if not national, approaches to these things. So, for example, your approach to institutional strengthening in a mature democracy like the UK is going to be very, very different to how it is in a number of other countries. So, my conclusion from that is that it's not that our analysis of the problem is wrong. There is a universality of citizens not liking corruption, believing in the rule of law and so on, but our solutions have been either too top-down and generalist or simply wrong, and we need to rethink those. But let's not pretend the problem isn't there and doesn't need dealing with.
Would you say that was what went wrong with Paul Wolfowitz's attempt at the World Bank to pursue corruption? And it got into a
I mean,
professionally call a tangle.
in many ways, yes. You know, the anti-corruption movement is about 25 years old, so it's very recent compared to, you know, lots of other of the global fights, human rights, environment, and so on. And I think, you know, we've learnt a lot in those 25 years. I disagree with Nairi, this sort of sense that it's kind of failed. I think it's, you know, it's a process and one's learning. And 25 years ago, people weren't even talking about corruption as being a big global problem. Now, everybody talks about that everywhere, and that is a huge step forward in itself, because it means there's an acknowledgement of the problem and a better analysis of the problem, and solutions will develop for that.
Any other quick thoughts on this? We have a lot of questions, so.
Well, I would just say that I think in response that the bigger project is how to link government, whatever kind of government it is, back to the people that government is supposed to be serving. That all around the world, people feel, whether it's in Brazil or the Philippines or in the United Kingdom or in Italy, people feel that the government does not represent them, is not on their side, that they have no voice in politics, they've been disempowered, and they're not just imagining that. In 23 out of 25 OECD countries, over 50% of people have seen their wages declining over the last 10 years. This isn't just an economic statistic. It means all their hopes that if they worked harder, their children would do better, get a decent education, get decent healthcare, have been smashed, and they're angry. And they have one power left, and that's the power to vote. And they are using that vote to say, we trust none of you. We will vote only for those who claim to be completely outsiders to the system. That is such a powerful challenge to what we like to imagine are our well-functioning democracies, because it goes right to the heart. It says no. 50 or 60% of the people simply don't believe that established political parties are representing them. And I think that's what we have to get at and say, so what's the solution to that? How do we stitch that back together? How do we present a case that says, no, governments are not just handmaidens of global forces. The governments are on your side, they are listening, and they've got a plan to redress. The last thing I would say is, to me, it also goes along with 20 years of democracies really disdaining government and putting it to one side. You know, I sit as Dean of a School of Government at a time which was born at a time when people had really started saying government is for the stupid, the mediocre, and the people that can't succeed in creating a startup or creating a company or doing something useful. So, you know, it wasn't true. But that's... And what
we have thick skins.
No, but what we have to do is attract the very best and brightest into government, but then give them morale, give them a boldness to start actually responding to that challenge. Because frankly, it's some of the non-democracies that are responding better. And my point is not, therefore, give up on democracy at all. It's say, be humble, learn what it is that those governments are doing. Some of it is about being long-term strategic. That's what our countries are failing to do. They're failing to be representative, and they're failing to actually come up with a long-term strategy. And that's why citizens are voting against them.
No, thanks very much. And you've taken us into some much wider points about representation and democracy, not just this point about corruption, and which other people have got questions about. Here in the front, please.
Much. Lisa Lutsevich from Chatham House Iran Ukraine Forum. And in Ukraine, people say this is the most openly corrupt country. And I think it's an interesting case of transition going right now. My take would be it's very important to understand the nature, how corruption emerged. And in a country like Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries, it's the limited access order that runs corruption. And what country is trying to do is to move to an open access order. So it's the transition state, which, you know, causes a lot of disorder in between. I agree with the ambassador to Iraq. And I think that my question would be then, we have some examples, some success stories where this transition between the two orders, from the limited to the open one, is a success?
Elena, do you have any thoughts on this?
I didn't have a thought particularly on this. I was actually wanting to go to the point of corruption and the judiciary that Emily made about Dilma and Lula.
But out a bit more then. Yeah, go on.
So, but it does link in a way to the issue of how do you go from a system where corruption is kind of acceptable to a system where corruption is actually out in the open and it actually becomes an issue of debate and something punishable. And that was what I was going to say to respond to you. Yes, there is the issue. there is the issue of Dilma, there's currently the issue of Lula, there is a politicization of the judiciary that right now is making, if you look at surveys, it's reducing the trust of citizens in the institutions. But apart from the Dilma-Lula trials, the judiciary has been there for the past, how many years, since the Lava Jato and Mensalão scandals, showing to the citizens that actually, corruption is not something you just talk about, but corruption is something that it's out, it's a public debate, it's punishable, and politicians are no longer immune. They don't have immunity. If they're corrupt, they're accountable for it. And I think there's very few institutions that can actually play this role. I think it's exactly the institutions you mentioned. It's the media, it's the judiciary, and these are really, I think, how you go from one situation to the other, where there is accountability by politicians and where corruption is no longer something that people talk about but nothing is done about. So I think in that sense, and you even see it when you look at these surveys that I mentioned, FGV has done some, trust in the judiciary rose a lot among Brazilian citizens during the years where you saw trials of politicians across the political spectrum on their involvement in corruption, and it always tends to decline where you see incidences of the politicization of the judiciary, which you can say we saw with Dilma or currently with the Lula process. But for me, that doesn't mean you throw out the good with the bad. There is good things happening and there's bad things happening together at the same time. And there's two sides to a very strong judiciary. And I think also this corresponds to your question about how did you go from one situation to another. There's a transition and it's gradual and it's not perfect, but it's about the institutions that Robert mentioned principally. You have to make sure they have the freedom to act and play their role.
Yeah, I'm going to leave corruption at this point here. We're coming right over to this side in the middle here. And then
this
to
is
this
just
end.
a brief point of information. I really like the way the directions have been, the conversation's been going, but it isn't just the people who have declining wages. It is by county the regions with higher inequality. So if you looked at the Trump vote, I know this was also true in Brexit and also the Ukraine, but the Trump vote, you saw the very wealthy voting for him too. But it was, like I said, where you have high inequality, which you could say is already the fracturing of governance. So they're accurately saying you're not doing redistribution well. But it also makes the wealthy feel that they don't belong and they shouldn't be paying taxes. So both the poor and the rich are losing faith in those regions.
Yeah, good point. Would you like to say who you are, please?
Oh, sorry, Joanna Bryson, University of Bath.
Terrific. Right over here at the side, please.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm Julius Moraga from UCL. I'm a Zimbabwean national. I think it doesn't need much contestation, really, that good governance is good for individuals, it's good for countries, and also good for the wider global space. But I think as academics, as practitioners, and many people interested in this, we have moved for so long with so many assumptions around the internal validity and the external validity of what constitutes best practice, which I think is really an issue that we need to revisit. How valid internally from the sources and also externally where we are trying to embed these practices, how valid are they? So it's a methodological question, but it's also a paradigm question. And I think as the world becomes more variegated, as we see individuals claiming more space in decision making, as we see the local context becoming more important in that, is that an opportunity for us to actually increase the internal validity and the external validity of best practice? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that point about best practice. Let's come here on the aisle.
Thank you so much. Ian Kelly, postgraduate student of diplomacy, University of Buckingham. In many countries around the world, there continues to be one industry that dominates the economy, which can, which can of course induce corruption, rent-seeking vested interests, whether it be agriculture or oil or financial services. Whatever it may be. And of course, one approach to addressing that is the rule of law, the international rule of law. But in the same countries, often that is portrayed as interference in internal affairs, and those perceptions are very much ingrained. So how does one reconcile those kind of those issues of perception and of interest as well? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Interesting question. Still broadly on the question of corruption, but also about whether there is one industry, as often happens, that dominates. Let's take a few more thoughts from the panel on corruption, but I then want to go into the questions that Nairi, I'll keep taking questions from the audience, but the questions that Nairi has raised about representation and connection with citizens. But more thoughts on these corruption and best practice points, anyone?
Well, I think there's a really strong link from Emily's point about the rule of law and Robert's point about corruption, and that's impunity. And I think the reason I react a little bit to the idea that we should, focus our efforts on fighting corruption in other parts of the world is that in our own countries, people are truly angry because of what they see as the impunity of bankers after the bank crisis, of, in some countries, judges, of Facebook for misusing their data, of multinationals for outsourcing their jobs and not paying taxes. There's a rage, there's an anger, which is, I think, rightly about impunity, because in the end, isn't that what we're trying to get at when we talk about democracy and the rule of law and anti-corruption? We're trying to say that there cannot be abuses of power which go unrestrained or unremarked, and that we've seen a really bad decade on that. And that our way back from that is not, in my view, to simply keep reciting values. It's to translate those values into a really clear ambition around what our institutions need to look like in a responsive way. And that means focusing on, as Europe has started to do, on who owns data, on what kinds of protections you have as a citizen from what could become an Orwellian state. It means focusing and redressing what happened after the global financial crisis, continuing to make sure that those who take great risks at the public's risk and on the public's implicit guarantee actually do face personal consequences because there are personal conduct issues. In other words, the way I see it, it's a huge job for government and for leadership across the private sector to stop permitting this kind of impunity, because the public have rumbled it, and they will simply keep voting the establishment out until the establishment responds to that.
Emily, your thought?
Yeah, I agree with you. But I think part of the continuing work has to be, we have to work internationally. And I think part of our challenge is that international political institutions are nothing like strong enough. And they certainly aren't strong enough in order to be able to counter a lot of these forces. And I think there's two elements additionally that I just want to touch on. And the first is, I think people are angry about international companies not paying their taxes. But I'm also quite clear that they are angry that rich individuals believe that they don't have to pay taxes, only little people have to pay taxes. And I think the use of offshore trusts and hiding of money internationally is something that makes people absolutely furious, and it should do. But I think that we as a country have to take action on that, but we also have to act internationally, and we have failed to do so, and we need to continue to. Can I just very cheekily pick up one point, and I appreciate I'm not allowed to debate Brazil all the time, but I am genuinely perplexed, bewildered as to why it is that, you talk about Dilma, Lula as if they're one person, and I think that's kind of interesting because Dilma ran Lula's office when Lula was corrupt, or alleged to be corrupt, but there was never any proof that Dilma was. And what I find so interesting is that when she was president, she was deposed for exaggerating, saying that the economy was stronger than it ought to be, without any evidence that she was actually corrupt. Whereas Lula, there are stronger allegations, and he is now the leading presidential candidate, but he has to be in jail. What I don't kind of get is why people don't disconnect Dilma from Lula. And is it because she's a girl? And I genuinely don't understand that. And I think that it's when we're talking about, when we're talking about good governance, I do think also we ought to just let's just crowbar in gender into this, and the role of women sometimes, and the way in which they can be marginalised.
Helena.
I really don't want to make this a debate. Last year there was a panel on Latin America in this conference, and maybe next year there should be one again. As I said, I think all of this is part of the politicization of the judiciary, that it could go either way. I think it's out of the context of this panel to talk about Dilma and Lula to that extent, but I'd be happy to talk about it afterwards. Can I make a point on what Nairi said about abuses of power and impunity?
Yes.
I think it hits at the core of this discussion. I just think the problem with governance now that needs to be fixed is the majority of the institutions that were established domestically and on the international level in the Western liberal world was exactly to make sure that there were no abuses of power, trying to heal this effect. And I think a big problem today is that in this time of populism, there's also a very big narrative about the institutions themselves abusing power, and citizens are really believing this, and many times these institutions and the fact that they abuse power are becoming elements on the national election agenda. I mean, you look at Greece and the discourse around the IMF and the EU a few elections, in the last election, you would think the abuse of power is coming from supranational or sort of intergovernmental organizations and from the whole multilateral system of international organizations. So I think it's really important to see how this can be decoupled and how institutions themselves can adapt and respond to this kind of perception that there is about it. I mean, we're living in a time when the perception about institutions, by and large, is not good in many countries, and people are skeptical of institutions. So if they're there to make sure that there's no abuse of power, there really needs to be some kind of change.
Yeah. And Nairi, I must say, I wonder, listening to you, whether you're sort of lambasting the behavior of kind of Western institutions, but giving some of the countries you referred to in the beginning, including Russia and China, a bit of a pass on this, in that the governments are not accountable in the way that you want many, many aspects of Western governments to be.
No, that's not at all. That's not at all my point. I just think there's a little bit of attention deficit when Europeans get together to gnash their teeth about the dreadful values of China and Russia without looking at what's happening in their own borders.
All right, that's a good point. Robert, I just want to ask you something quickly, particularly about tech companies, which we haven't referred to, but we're discussing before we came on the stage, whether you think they're bad for government in the sense that they're very hard to regulate and in a way, moving big tech companies moving outside the realm of governance, or good in the sense of bringing many tools to government that it didn't otherwise have.
Can I just answer a couple of other things first?
Absolutely. Then I mean,
first of all, let's be clear, we should not be giving a free pass to the governments of Russia and China. Highly repressive regimes, pretty nasty to their citizens. It goes against many values that I think their own citizens hold, and we need to be alert and awake to that. Secondly, I absolutely agree with Nairi's impunity point. This is a problem. There's no doubt about that across the world, everywhere. And let's not forget that this country, the UK, is highly complicit in other countries' impunity when the money that is stolen from foreign health budgets and education budgets comes to London and is used via the British Virgin Islands to buy houses in Kensington. I mean, that is our bankers, our lawyers, our accountants, our trust and company service providers complicit in that global system of corruption, whether the money is from Russia, China, or elsewhere. So on to the tech point. I mean, tech is both a threat and an opportunity, I think, in this governance space. That the threat is that it could be effectively captured by governments and subverted and used indeed. And one's seen, and Ukraine's a good example, I think, of other countries using corruption as statecraft, effectively to subvert countries that they want to see fail. So tech can be used very badly, but it's a massive opportunity for civil society. I mean, civil society in 10 years ago was a small number of kind of largish NGOs. Now civil society is every citizen in the world who has access to the internet and can gain information, can be personal holders to account of governments and so on. And that's a massive opportunity, but also quite a big challenge to governments who are threatened by that.
Thank you. And I've had a note from the Chatham House organisers that as we started 10 minutes late, we will run to 5:02, so there's a bit more time for questions. Here on the aisle.
Hello, yes, I'm Indra Adnan of the Alternative UK, part of an international political platform which exists to answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And what I've heard over the last couple of days is the use of the word populism, which sort of suggests that at the moment we're afraid of the people's voice, whereas actually is the people's voice the source of a new politics for the future? And one of the facts that we uncovered about Europe is that only 2% of people are members of political parties. I mean, it's quite staggering if you think about it. 2% of people are buying into the current political discourse. And what they've managed to do over the past few years is to show their discontent with that. And you'd think, wouldn't you, that politicians then, therefore, or governance with integrity, would immediately think, how do we get to understand the people better? Right? Instead of that, we hear all the time, how do we educate the people? How do we tell them what we think? How do we get them to understand what we do? Really, surely the challenge is, how do we find the ways to hear people better? And just would like to know from the panel what they think of the principles, for example, of subsidiarity, and what they think of localism, and what they think of municipalism, because this is where social media is actually enabling people increasingly at the moment, but there doesn't seem to be an ear for them.
Thank you very much indeed for that, which takes us into a really interesting, slightly new space on this. Populism and how to listen to the people, not educate them. And that chimes with the question I've got here on Slido, come in anonymously. How can we have integrity in governance without the structures for engaging and hearing the people? Or perhaps can we? Emily, you are a politician.
I think, well, first of all, speaking as somebody from a party that has 600,000 members, and a party which certainly, it's our abiding, I think, principle is that the public is there to educate us. And the reason I knock on doors is to, and I do it, and I always have, and I always will, is that nobody, no matter how senior they are in any political party, should think that they have finished their education and they need to continue to listen to people. And I think that really is genuinely the approach that we have, and I think that has given us, quite a lot of success, and the biggest increase in the Labour vote since 1945 in the last election. And I think that change of approach is an important one, but I don't think that you should say that populism is the voice of the people. I think that's the issue, is when is it that there is a manipulation of the people, and when do we and how do we actually try to make sure that we genuinely hear the people's voice and make sure that we are listening and not just picking up on what a particular newspaper may say that people want or anything else. And so we need to make sure that we're properly grounded, and that takes a lot of work. I think that some of the institutions that we've had in the past that have been they've been there to try to capture the voice of the people and the will of the people, such as, we have various community projects in my constituency, where, my local councillors will go along, there'll be a forum, You get the 1.5%. You don't even get the 2% who belong to political parties across the country, across Europe. You just get a tiny proportion of them, and they are not necessarily representative. And that's the issue, so that is the issue. So you have to make sure that you take your information as to what it is that the public want from a variety of sources, and constantly know that you cannot be sure, and you have to keep trying in order to make sure that you really do understand and have your finger on the pulse of what it is that people want, and that it is your job as a public servant to understand what it is that they want in order to be able to deliver. Sorry, it's quite a long speech.
No, thank you for that. Elena, I want to come to you on this. If you look at Europe and the anxieties about migration and how that has expressed itself, for example, in Hungary, but also in Italy at the moment, do you think European leaders and the Commission are guilty of not listening enough to people's concerns about that? Or do you think they should, continue to tell people how to respond to migration?
Well, it's working for the European Parliament right now. It's hard to answer that without the Chatham House rule. But I think I can say this. I think migration is a really good example of the difference between considering that populism is the voice of the people being heard and democracy and politics being the voice of the people being heard. And I say this because the difference, to me at least, between politics and democracy versus populism is that populism makes promises it cannot deliver on necessarily, whereas politics is the art of the feasible. It's saying we will do some things, but it's feasible to do them. I think on the issue of migration in Europe, we've seen tremendous amounts of populism. I think some of the narratives that certain leaders present sort of follow a line of thinking which is completely rational, i.e. that something that is there can disappear. It's not disappearing. It's an issue. It can have potentially good consequences for Europe. So I think populism is really destructive in this discussion about migration. Now, as far as the European, there was actually a panel on this yesterday as to what the EU is doing about this. Again, I think here comes the issue of governance, because the EU is a very specific structure of governance, and I'm not sure it was formulated to tackle these types of problems. So we see this paradox of problems coming up that the EU is responding to by adapting rather than by being prepared for them. And I think this is why we see this kind of discussion and inability, in a way, to tackle the problem in the most efficient manner. Adding to that populism, we are in the situation that we are, which is almost a perfect storm.
No, I want to just perhaps take in two more questions and use them as a prompt for the last thoughts from the panel. There was one here in the middle, and then is there one or two in the front? I'm going to take all these three and ask the panel to give their last thoughts. Right in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Yoso. I'm chief link scholar from Indonesia. So I think I just jump right to the question. So who do you think we should entrust with in placing this governance? Because if we rely on if we rely to local parliament or local government, I think we have witnessed that two of the presidents just managed to convince their parliament or Congress to strengthen his status quo in the government this year. And then should we rely to international framework or international authorities, by which I'm honestly quite skeptical as well, because it was mentioned a bit by Robert that I think in this panel that most of the contributors to this corruption, directly or indirectly, are large multinational companies, by which they are mostly in bed with the large economies, the large economist states in the world.
Yeah. So, forgive me, sir. Could we make it really brief?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Trying to get in.
So in short, it might be like conflict of interest in enforcing or harshly enforcing this international anti-corruption framework.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Here in the front. And two, and will you forgive me if you could make them very brief?
Very, very brief. I thought your word feasible was actually quite a key word, in the sense that I think there is a big disconnect as well between understanding from the public space what is feasible politically to be able to carry out policy. I think we need that communication to happen. And actually, Brazil has this thing, e-democracia, where they have young people who are allowed to listen in on debates. And that's where I think there's bigger understanding of what actually everybody needs. And I'm wondering...
Will you forgive me?
Yes, and what is
quote our Prime Minister, brief means brief.
So do you think digital rights and internet democracy might be a way through to find that space?
Thank you.
Just to comment, another thing that we need to think about that probably goes through the thread here.
Excuse me, could you speak into the microphone?
The political... Closer to me. Oh, sorry. Okay. The political parties themselves, I mean, for example, in the U.S., the Democratic Party is obviously trying to, step up and be able to turn midterm elections and things of this nature. But what you're finding is, frankly, new people that are qualified, that are stepping up to run for offices in the states or whatever, individual states, are actually not being backed by the old school, I use the term old school, but by the establishment, because there are chosen people that the establishment chooses as their sure horse winner, and people that are really, perhaps maybe have more to give and can answer and reflect more of what the populist folks are looking at.
Thank you, forgive me.
No.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, point on corruption, on internet democracy, on parties and the real voice. I'm afraid these have to be micro thoughts. Let's go from the end.
Okay, so
seconds, not minutes.
What's so interesting, and one of the reactions to Trump, has been the number of women who wanted to come forward and stand for election. Is it 63,000 women? From dog catcher upwards. The difficulty for me, I think, and it's a challenge for the Democratic Party and for the American system, is that it isn't just that you need to persuade the political party, really you need to persuade the political party that you can raise enough money And what worries me is that, you know, speaking to congressmen, they said that they spend every single morning raising money, not just for themselves, but also capturing those who will end up giving the money to their opponent unless they are friends with them. And that is, to me, the key. And one of the other keys is that and I hope that the Democrats do very well in the midterms, but what I want them to do with that power is to start introducing some transparency into how money is spent and how candidates are funded, because with that transparency, I hope certain organisations and individuals will take fright and back out of the political system, which will in turn open it up to it being more genuinely representative.
Wonderful.
I avoid the word populism because I think what we need to fight it in a way is direct democracy. And why do I say that? Because democracy is about doing three things: making really difficult trade-off decisions. That's what governments do. They decide a road goes to you but not to you. Trade-off decisions with good information, and then being held responsible for those decisions. When you do direct democracy, when you do a referendum, when you do a mass vote on a policy issue, you're short-circuiting all three of those things. You're having people without the information who are not making a public interest trade-off and not taking responsibility for the decision actually decide. That's why human beings invented representative democracy. So I think that's my first point, is that we have to defend...
Nairi, I'm afraid.
The second point is local democracy, fantastic. That, to me, is the solution. What we're seeing is really innovative democracy work at the level of cities, at the level of local communities. We need to build from there.
Great. Thank you. Elena.
Well, I'll end on an optimistic note, responding to the lady here in the front. I think the internet offers incredible opportunities to hold government and governance institutions accountable and responsible. In Brazil, apart from what you mentioned, there's now apps to monitor the budget, apps to introduce legislation for citizens. In various European countries, there are Parliament Watch apps. I just think there needs to be a bridge for all of this to be built into the system of representative democracy.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you. I mean, for me, the fundamental question is what is in the interests of the citizens? And governments across the world have been getting that very wrong, whether it's top-down impositions in various systems. And I think, when I look at China as an example, I think telling citizens what is in their interest and not listening to them is not a great way to proceed, just as I don't think for the rest of the world order to say, this is the system, everybody else needs to take it is the right way. So I think we've got to listen to citizens at local level. That's critical. My final thought is a very boring thought, which is that in all this talk about institutions, the boring things are incredibly important. Audit, managing conflicts of interest, independent oversight, stuff that we can completely take for granted, ignore. You let that go at your peril, and once it's gone, it's very difficult to put back.
Thank you. Thanks for a terrific session and those very, very good questions. We've had a lot about rule of law and corruption. Not much about the economy and prosperity, but other sessions deal emphatically with that. And we've ended up with where I think is exactly the right place in this question of how governments, whether democratic or not, are accountable to their citizens and reflect what those citizens most want. So with that, many thanks indeed. Can you join me in thanking the panel?